Hey, let me start with a wedding. It is about 12,000 years ago. Small camp, maybe 30 people, everybody related to everybody. And two young people are getting married, except she is not from this camp. She walked here, 4 days, through country her family does not own, to marry a man she had met twice. Nobody in that camp thinks this is romantic. They think it is necessary. And every human society that has ever existed came up with the same idea, separately, without ever talking to each other. Here is the rule: you cannot marry your close relatives. You already knew that, you have never once had to be taught it. And that is the strange part, because that rule is the only thing our entire species has ever unanimously agreed on. Every continent, every era. Groups that had no contact for 40,000 years all independently arrived at it. We have no other universal law, not murder. Plenty of societies kept lists of people you were allowed to kill, not theft, not lying. Just this one. And the second you step outside your own culture, it goes completely insane. Because close relatives turns out to mean absolutely nothing. Every society drew a line, nobody drew it in the same place. And some of the places they drew it are going to make your head hurt. Start with cousins. In an enormous number of societies, southern India, large parts of the Amazon, Aboriginal Australia, you are not merely permitted to marry your first cousin. You are supposed to. It is the preferred marriage. Your parents are quietly hoping for it, but not just any cousin. A specific one, your mother's brother's daughter. So picture that camp again, two girls the same age as you, both your cousins, both standing right there. One of them your family has been waiting years for you to marry. The other one, if you touch her, they can kill you. And the only thing that separates them is which parent they came through. Let me be precise, because this is the hinge of the entire video. Your mother's brother's daughter is a cross cousin. Marriage, celebration, everyone delighted. Your father's brother's daughter is a parallel cousin. That is incest. In some societies it carried a death sentence. Now both of those women are your first cousin. Both share exactly 1/8 of your DNA. 1/8, identical. There is no biological difference between them, none. You could not find one with a modern laboratory. One is a wedding. The other is an execution. Sit with that, because it kills the explanation you were about to reach for. You were about to say, obviously the rule is about birth defects. They noticed inbreeding caused problems, so they banned relatives. Sensible. Reasonable. Except they married one cousin and executed you for the other, and those two cousins are genetically identical to you. So it is not about blood. Whatever this rule is, that is not what it is. And it gets worse. Travel to the Middle East and the rule does not merely change, it inverts. There, marrying your father's brother's daughter, the execution one, is the preferred match. There is a specific term for it. It was considered the ideal, the safest, the most respectable marriage available. Same relative, opposite verdict. Two societies on the same planet. Which means if you had walked from one region to the other, carrying nothing but your intentions, you would have transformed from ideal husband into criminal without altering one thing about yourself. The woman did not change. Your relationship to her did not change. Your DNA did not change. Only the ground under your feet changed. So the rule is universal and its contents are arbitrary. Every society has one. No two agree. That is a genuinely strange shape for a law to have. Universal rules usually come from universal causes: gravity, hunger, fear of snakes. Arbitrary rules usually come from culture, and culture is not universal. This is somehow both. Hold on to that, we are coming back to it. And if you want to see how far the arbitrary end can go, you go to Australia. Because some Aboriginal societies did not simply say, not your sister. They built a machine. In a number of these systems, every person alive belongs to one of 8 named categories. You are born into yours. You do not choose it, you cannot change it, and everybody knows yours on sight. Your category tells you exactly one category you are permitted to marry. Not a suggestion. 1. And here is the part that genuinely impresses me. Your children do not inherit your category, and they do not inherit your wife's. They land in a third category, determined by the combination of the two. Which means the system automatically rotates every family through the whole structure across generations. It is a self-correcting mechanism for keeping a scattered population from ever folding in on itself, and it was running for thousands of years before anybody wrote anything down. Nobody in that society could explain it in the terms I just used. There was no committee. There was no founder. They would tell you it is simply the law and that it came from the ancestors and that people who break it bring disaster on everybody. Which is not a bad way to enforce a population-level algorithm you cannot see the top of. Now let us talk about the people who were exempt, because obviously there were people who were exempt. Egyptian royalty married siblings as official state policy. Not a scandal, not a secret policy. The Ptolemies Cleopatra's dynasty kept it up for 11 generations. Their family tree is not a tree, it is a knot. Ptolemy VIII married his sister. Then later he also married his sister's daughter, who was therefore his niece and also his stepdaughter, while he remained married to her mother. He was three separate things to the same household, and two of them were husband. And the logic was not confusion, it was theology. The pharaoh was not a man who ruled Egypt, he was a god who happened to be standing in Egypt. You do not dilute a god by mixing him with a commoner. The bloodline was the divinity. So the safest possible marriage was the one that kept the god concentrated. They were not breaking the rule, they were declaring themselves outside the category the rule applied to. Biology does not care about theology. Tutankhamun's parents were full brother and sister. We are not guessing. His mummy was DNA tested in 2010. Full siblings. He had a cleft palate. He had a deformed left foot with bone that was dying while he was still alive. He could not walk unaided. When they opened his tomb, they found more than 130 walking sticks buried with him, not ceremonial, worn, used. He was dead at 19. And that is the detail that stays with me, not the gold, not the mask. A teenage boy called a living god by every person who ever spoke to him, who needed a stick to cross his own throne room. The boy king was not a king who happened to be sick. He was sick because he was a king. And before you file this under ancient people being ancient, Europe ran the identical experiment, much later, with much better record keeping. The Spanish Habsburgs married uncle to niece and cousin to cousin for 2 centuries to keep the crown in the family. The result was Charles II, whose ancestry was so folded in on itself that geneticists calculate he was about as inbred as the child of a brother and sister. He had the famous jaw, so pronounced he could not chew properly. He could barely speak. He was infertile. He died at 38, and the dynasty that spent 200 years protecting its bloodline ended by running out of one. 2 empires, different continents, 1,500 years apart, same theory, same method, same ending, which is a reasonably strong argument that the rule everyone else was following was doing something useful, but it still does not tell us what. Okay, back to everybody who was not a god and had to actually follow the rule. Here is where this stops being a history video and starts being about you, because it turns out you might not need the law at all. Israel, 20th century, the kibbutz movement. Children raised communally, not by their parents, but in a children's house with the same small group of kids from infancy. Same room, same meals, same everything. They are not related, they simply grow up inside each other's lives. A researcher went looking for marriages inside those peer groups. Nearly 3,000 marriages examined. Between 2 people raised together in the same group from birth, essentially none. Nobody forbade it, nobody discouraged it. There was no rule, no warning, no disapproving parent. The community would in fact have been delighted. These were ideologically committed families who wanted their children to stay. The kids simply found each other completely unappealing. Which is suggestive, it is not proof. Maybe those kids knew each other too well, maybe something about that specific community. What you would really want is a society that took 2 unrelated children, raised them together deliberately, and then required them to marry. Which, unfortunately for them and conveniently for us, is a thing that happened. Taiwan, a custom called minor marriage. A family adopts a baby girl and raises her in the house alongside the son she is going to marry. Same home from infancy. The wedding is arranged before either of them can speak. The colonial administration kept meticulous household records so we can check what actually happened to these marriages. They produced roughly 1/3 fewer children. They had dramatically higher rates of adultery. They divorced far more often than ordinary arranged marriages in the same villages. Same culture, same law, same arranged wedding. The only variable was that they grew up together. Everyone involved wanted these marriages to work. The families had invested years. The couples had every social pressure in the world pushing them together. It did not matter. Something underneath had already decided. That something is called the Westermarck effect. If you spend early childhood in close daily contact with another person, your brain quietly files them under family and switches off sexual attraction. Permanently, you do not choose it, you cannot undo it later, and critically, it never checks whether you are actually related. It has no access to that information. It only checks who was in the room. So the aversion is not moral and it is not learned. It is a piece of machinery installed before you had opinions running on proximity. For most of human history, the people in the room were your relatives, so the machine worked. Which leaves an enormous and obvious problem. It is the problem this whole video has been walking toward. If the aversion is already built in, if you genuinely do not want to, then why does every society on earth also need a written law, a punishment, a name for the crime, and in some cases an executioner? You do not legislate against something nobody wants to do. There is no law against eating gravel. So the law is not doing the job we assumed. It is not stopping anybody. The brain already handled that. It is doing something else entirely, and once you see it, the whole thing snaps into focus. Here is the answer. The rule was never a ban on who you sleep with. It is a command about who you are forced to make friends with. Read it in the positive and it says something completely different. It does not say not your sister. It says go outside, find another group, deal with strangers, come back connected to them. If you cannot marry inside your own group, then every marriage has to reach outside it. Every wedding becomes a treaty. Every child becomes a shared relative between two groups who now have a very concrete reason not to kill each other. Now go back and look at the camp from the beginning. That woman who walked 4 days to marry a man she had met twice, she is not a bride. She is a border agreement. Her children will have grandparents in 2 territories. When her camp starves, there is somewhere to walk to. When her husband's camp is raided, there are people obliged to care. She is infrastructure. And this is what resolves the cousin problem. Marrying your mother's brother's daughter renews an alliance your parents already built. It maintains a link between 2 lineages across generations. Marrying your father's brother's daughter keeps you inside your own lineage. Same family, same land, same allies. It buys you nothing. One builds a network, the other builds a wall. Nobody was protecting a gene pool. They had no concept of a gene. They were preventing isolation, and isolation for a group of 30 people is not a social inconvenience. It is a death sentence with a delay on it. And once you see marriage as infrastructure, the price tag makes sense too. In a great many societies, a man could not simply take a wife. He owed her family years hunting for them, building for them, living under her father's authority while he worked the debt off. Sometimes a decade. That is not a courtship. That is a treaty with a payment schedule. And you do not pay 10 years of labor for a woman from your own camp. You pay it for the alliance she comes attached to. There is one more piece of evidence I love, and it is almost comedic. In a number of societies, Aboriginal Australia especially, a man is forbidden from speaking to his mother-in-law. Not discouraged, forbidden. He may not look at her, may not share a shelter with her, may not say her name. Some groups developed an entire separate vocabulary, a mother-in-law language used only when she might be within earshot. Different words, same grammar. A whole dialect that exists because 2 people are not permitted to acknowledge each other. That is not a rule about desire. Nobody has ever built a language to prevent an attraction. That is a rule for managing 2 families who are now permanently, awkwardly bound together and who need very clear instructions on how not to destroy the alliance that binds them. And none of this is finished, by the way. First cousin marriage is legal today across most of Europe, and it is banned outright in roughly half of American states. Same continent, same century, same relative, one side of a state line it is a wedding, the other side it is a crime. We are still doing it. We are still drawing the line in different places and calling our version the obvious one. The arguing never stopped. It just moved into legislatures. So the oldest law humanity ever produced is not about sex. It is a rule that forces every family on earth to permanently depend on strangers. It is the reason we ever built anything larger than a household, because a household that only marries itself stays a household forever and then it dies. Every group that kept the rule spread. Every group that did not. And every person alive today is descended from people who obeyed it. Including the ones who really did not want to. Tell me in the comments which version your culture runs on, cross cousin, parallel, or neither. The map is stranger than you would expect, and I read the replies. And subscribe, because next time it is what people used before toilet paper. I need you to understand that it is worse.